Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our latest session in our series, Why Marx? Tonight, we're looking at a rather big question, a very important question, though, which is the question of Marx and what he had to say, Marx and Engels, and what they had to say about the question of money. And if you've seen the advert, I put it slightly cheeky by asking, is money the root of all evil, which is quite a famous saying, you will have heard it loads of times. If we need to get rid of money, that's the key problem. I think Marx might have had a different view on the matter. And to look at the issue more closely, we're very pleased tonight to have John Holliday and Rob Gould, who have divided it up a little bit. And we're starting with John for 20 to 30 minutes, then Rob. And then, as always, we're opening up for question and comments, contributions from the floor. So thank you very much for joining us. John, please.
Right, thank you, Tina. I think you're going to share my screen. I've tried to produce some slides. They won't always be, as straightforward as I intended. I don't find it at all easy. The first slide is from what is termed the economic and philosophic manuscripts that Marx wrote in the 1840s. The one that I've identified here is basically the human requirements under private property and socialism, written in 1844. I did have the quote, but it is quite lengthy. If you don't mind, I've paraphrased it, but I will just read out some of the sections, because I do think it's an important quote, and in which he manages to identify a lot of the problems that we still face with a society dominated by the money social relation. So he starts off in this particular section. The chapter starts off, and he's talking then about socialism and the nature of the society in which he's engaged at the time, dominated by private property and money. So he starts off, "We have seen what significance, given socialism, the wealth of human needs acquires, and what significance, therefore, both a new mode of production and a new object of production obtain. A new manifestation of the forces of human nature and a new enrichment of human nature." That's what he classifies as under socialism. However, under private property, tends to use the words private property rather than capital at this stage. Under private property, their significance is reversed. Every person speculates on creating a new need in another, so as to drive him to a fresh sacrifice, to place him in a new dependence, and to seduce him into a new mode of enjoyment and therefore economic ruin. Sorry about the use of the words him all the time. That's the way he writes. Each tries to establish over the other an alien power, so as thereby to find satisfaction of his own selfish need. Every new product represents a new potentiality of mutual swindling and mutual plundering. Think of AI at this point. Man becomes ever poorer as man. His need for money becomes ever greater. He finishes, "The need for money is therefore the true need produced by the economic system, and it is the only need which the latter produces. The quantity of money becomes to an ever greater degree its sole effective quality. Just as it reduces everything to its abstract form, so it reduces itself in the course of its own movement to quantitative being. Excess and intemperance come to be its true norm." Finishes up, and this is from the next section, which is on the power of money. "Money is the alienated ability of mankind." So I think what he's trying to do there is obviously identify the problems of living in a developing capitalist society, which he's in at the time, but identifying that problem of money. And money runs throughout his work from the 1840s right through to Capital. Money is a central feature. He's trying to explore the nature of money and the functions that it serves within a capitalist system of society. So if I go on to the next section. What I think within this, Marx is trying in the economic and philosophic manuscripts is identifying the problem he's seeing the society in which he lives and the corruption that's involved in it, the unfairness, the inequalities, the cheating, the swindling, etc. But what he wants to do is go beneath this to see what this originates from. So again, from an early stage, even in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, he goes beneath what he terms the appearances, and this is a fundamental notion of his definition of science, to the real source of the problems, to the essence of things. And he finds this not in the market relations of capitalism, not in the unfairness, the inequality, the cheating, etc., but in the mode of production. So even if everything was done fairly and equally within a capitalist society, you would still get exploitation. He identifies the exploitation as coming from the capitalist mode of production. A mode of production is defined by its forces of production. All societies have to produce the wealth by which they live, but also by the social and technical relations of production. It's the social relations of production that vary and characterize a society. But the capitalist mode of production, he identifies these relations of capital, wage labor, the commodity production, and money. E1's capital, wage, commodity, money. Within that, capital is the production of surplus value through the exploitation of wage labor. For Marx, that is the real source of profit, rent, and interest, the way surplus value is distributed, but at its root is exploitation of wage labor. The fundamental relation is that of exploitation, is that of capital and wage labor. So profit arises from that and is then distributed in the market forms through profit, rent, and interest. Products are sold and the surplus value created in production is distributed in that way. In a way, it goes beyond a lot of the characterizations of capitalism that we're familiar with. People do just see it as a society of cheating, of unfairness, of buying cheap to sell dear. Marx goes beneath that to relate it to the exploitation of wage labor underlying it. Money is a key feature of that mode of production. It's a social relation of production. It's something that can change. So we could go on to the next section, please. I think this is basically, he wrote throughout his life, he's writing and developing a critique of money and political economy, the political economy that exists at his time in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. That's James Mill, but he's also Adam Smith and Ricardo, all the classical, John Stuart Mill, all the classical political economies. He's trying to develop a critique of their economy because it celebrates the nature of capital. He's trying to compare it with the real way capital, the capitalist mode of production, operates and the problems that it creates. So in this section, it's called the Introduction to his Critique of Political Economy, which is a work I think produced in 1859. He doesn't publish this here, but it is available as the introduction to the Grundrisse if people are interested. Marx is here dealing with his method of how he will deal with political economy, the basis of his method of political economy. But throughout that, he's doing what I've said. His emphasis is on production. He talks about distribution, he talks about exchange and consumption, but production predominates in the whole functioning of that society. But you will hear a lot of people say today, I listened to somebody on the TV the other day, a socialist or identifying as a socialist, saying, we're not really bothered about production. What we're interested in is distribution. Distribution should be fair. For Marx, distribution is intimately connected with the productive system. So he finishes there, a definite production determines a definite consumption, a distribution and exchange, as well as definite relations between these different moments. So he sees the social relations of production as the major problem, not just the distributive mechanisms. If we go on to the next slide, Tina. This is the contribution that previous one was an introduction to. He didn't publish the introduction. He did publish this work, and here he's dealing with the circulation of commodities and the money form that arises from circulation of commodities. That's the simpler form. He's not dealing here with capital. He's not dealing here with credit. He's dealing with money as it exists in simple circulation, buying and selling as it emerges from the exchange of commodities. A particular form of money develops in that. He also tries to clarify here at an early stage price. The difference between money and price. Money he identifies as a necessary appearance of abstract labor. Price is an estimate. It's what capitalists and people who sell do all the time. They estimate what a product will fetch on the market, how the profit will be, the surplus value will be realized, but it's only an estimate of the surplus value that's contained in the money form. It gives a money form to surplus value, puts a price on it, but it may not be realized, it may not be sold, it may not be sold as much as it wants, but its price is something that varies. It doesn't define the value, it tries to estimate it. So it's, again, quite a complicated feature. And it's an ideal form of value. Value he defines as socially necessary labor time, the total labor time available to a society at any given time. And price is an ideal form of that value that can only be realized through sales. So price can vary all the time, and clearly does. Again, just emphasize that he's not dealing with the total capitalist mode of production here, just a section of it. He publishes this work, but it's not a very successful work, and I think he's not satisfied with it, so he goes on to write Capital. So if we go on to the next section. Around the same time, and they do overlap with them, is the Grundrisse. He's writing this around the same time he's doing the Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, and they cover largely the same grounds. But anybody who thinks that Marx is not dealing with social relations, he's not dealing with money, only has to look at the Grundrisse. These are his rough notes. Large sections of it are devoted to money, large sections devoted to capital. Very interesting work, very rambling work, but it largely shows how Marx is working out his ideas, which he will then try to formulate in Capital, the only work that he did eventually publish in his lifetime on political economy, or the major work that he published on political economy. But the notes, again, are very interesting. But I would ask people, if you're interested in grasping the nature of money, then I think you should read the Grundrisse and just go with it, because it shows how he changes his ideas. He misses some things out, other things he takes into account. Okay, and for the next section. With all these topics, the money is clearly a feature of society that's associated for Marx with alienation, with fetishism and reification. He says, in the form of society now under consideration, behavior of men in social production is purely atomic. Relations to each other in production assume a material character independent of their control. These facts manifest themselves by products taking the form of commodities. So in this is from the chapter 2 of Capital. He talks about the riddle of the money fetish, how we are completely baffled by money. We don't know what it is, and yet we use it every day. The riddle of the money fetish is the riddle of the commodity fetish, now visible and glaring to our eyes. He's trying to get beneath the nature of money. Okay, the next section. For Marx, money is intimately connected with that basis of exchange value, which is abstract labor. The categories he develops in his political economy are not things, but social relations expressed through things. He's constantly trying to emphasize that you can't grasp. Classical political economy constantly talked about wages, money, commodities, capital as things. Marx is trying to say beneath that appearance of things, it expresses a social relationship, and a social relationship of exploitation. It mystifies the nature of the capitalist mode of production, and that way allows it to continue. It's precisely the finished form of the world of commodities, the money form, which conceals the social character of labor and social relations between workers by making them appear as relations between material objects instead of revealing them plainly. value has an objective quality. It operates within society, but it is purely social. So what I think he's emphasizing there is a social relation can change, does change, and can be changed. And labor, wage labor, socially necessary labor, labor on a global scale is the basis of all wealth production. And it's trying to reveal that. It's expressed through money, but the money relation conceals the social nature of that production and allows exploitation to continue unchallenged. So I've finished that. The total labor available to society, which movement of determines its structure, takes the form of a things. David Harvey talks in one of his lectures about how he asks his students, he asks them where they got their breakfast this morning. Of course, usually it involves, well, I bought a packet of Weetabix, I bought cornflakes, or I bought a cup of coffee here. He always says to them, go further back, go further back. And by doing so, he eventually reveals all these products are the result of social labor, people producing throughout the world, the labor, total labor available to society, in which we can only relate to, the consumer only relates to through expenditure of money. So it conceals the social nature of production and takes it into just one form, the money form. So the next section. So that's the nature. It's an abstractive process that we do every day. Human beings do it all the time within capitalist society. Money is the real abstraction we make on a daily basis without thinking about it. We don't ask what money is. We don't see that it's a necessary appearance of social labor. We tend to just spend it, get what we can from it. It's a mystifying relation, a relation which we are involved in on a daily basis. From this, it's that notion of reification that Marx develops and is pursued by other theorists in Marxian terms like Lukács, concept of reification, describing a form of social consciousness in which human beings relate to things through the physical of properties of things. And so it appears like money becomes a force of nature. We don't question it, we just use it. And it's in these forms of practice that we continue in the concealment of the real nature of social production. The social nature of wealth production is concealed within the monetary form. So we can't envisage a world without that form of society. But do ask yourself, if Marx is writing all these problems in the 1840s through to the 1860s, but here he is able to question money. He is able to see it as an abstraction. He is able to see it as a social relation, similar to wage labor. And he's talking to a lot of people who understand that nature of social relations of money and capital and wage labor, and even talk about the abolition of wage labor. Today, if you relate to it, then people don't question it. It's hard for them to even envisage a society other than the one that we've got. The society has got, you can't envisage a society without wage labor, without money, without capital, without production for profit. It's that nature of reification which seems to me to have actually increased since Marx's days. So you will not even find socialists talking about the nature of money. They tend to talk about the nature of distribution within a capitalist society rather than the production relations, rather than the nature of money as a social relation. Okay. And sorry, I've gone on to what I take to be some of the consequences of this, because they obviously have a clear effect on the world that we live in today. It's that separation that money provides from the separation of purchase from sale, a society in which everything concerns buying and selling, exchange relationships. And that relationship of our world, the way we use money, and it forces us to separate time and space. We tend to live in the future. We tend to, as Wordsworth says, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. We tend to think of what we could do with the money in next week. Where's the money going to come from the week after next? It divorces that social nature of production, the immediate space of production, from a speculative nature of society. some of the other features as well are about, we talk here about money of account, bank money, separating production from consumption, purchase from sale. Commodities have to be held separate. They have to be purchased before they can be used, rather than in a natural way. Most societies produce for use, immediate or even planned use, but not for sale. So there's a relation between the human beings and the products. And of course, within that gap between purchase and sale, money is a basis for crisis, because obviously you separate purchase from sale, from use from exchange, then there's a gap within that. But through hoarding, etc., through non-investment of capital, forms the basis, or could form the basis, for a crisis. I don't think Marx has that is the financial crisis, the only form of crisis, but it certainly lays the basis for crises of a particular form, which Marx is throughout his writings. He's emphasizing part of the problems with capital, as he sees, is its fundamental nature that induces crisis as a possibility virtually all the time. And we always live on the edge of crises. Crises are always occurring, taking different forms, and sometimes in present will existential terms, and that would include the environment and war, an example of that. So if you take a division between production for use and production for exchange, in most societies, human beings involve themselves with nature, produce the means whereby they live, essentially the social metabolism. Human beings regulate and control nature, have to produce the means whereby they live. That's a fundamental feature in societies based on an exchange and money. That relationship, that basis of the underlying feature of social labor is lost. And exchange relations, profitability dominate, which are totally outside of the control of human beings. So that nature of profit, producing for profit, producing for exchange, takes over as the purpose of production rather than human need. And as long as that continues, the emphasis is going to be on growth of capital, growth of profit, etc. That's a fundamental danger for the way we relate to the earth, for the ecological sustainability of the planet. Okay, I think I've said enough there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. That's a good introduction to the subject, and I think quite rightly, focusing on the difference between society. I mean, people always produce things. People have always done things and created and worked, etc. But that's for ourselves. That's different from a commodity, isn't it? A commodity is produced to be sold rather than for use of yourself or your family, etc. So it's a good introduction. Thank you, John. Rob, I believe we'll go into that in a bit more detail now, and also going to share some formulas. Yay.
So John has kind of covered a lot of the early part of the presentation, but he does expand further in capital. So I'm going to continue as I was anyway. I'll kick off. Preparation for this talk was no small feat. Marx writes extensively on the topic of money in his kind of magnus opus, Capital. This presentation will attempt to summarize roughly 8 chapters of the book in 20 minutes. So forgive me if I lack depth in some of the areas I cover. I do recommend reading Capital, as it has tremendous relevance to our world today. Although published in 1867, the framework for examining the underlying laws of the mode of production of capital established by Marx retain their clout under modern scrutiny.
Sorry, Rob, you're really quiet again. I think there's
really quiet.
You've moved to, yeah.
Is that better? Is it better now?
Slightly better, yeah.
Okay, I don't know what's happening. It was fine before. It's not fine now.
Yeah.
We'll carry on. Okay, I will project with emphasis.
Thank you.
How I get around it. Okay. So though dense and often saturated with close examination of the particular processes in the circulation of capital, the overall argument is both strong and insightful. I recommend the work of David Harvey for keeping one foot on the ground and having a guide to the ebb and flow of Marx's argument here. even though he does shy away from the political implications of capital. Some of the analysis I will present, though, is not entirely my own. It has been forged in a 2-year process of reading Capital with the Socialist Theory Study Group. And I owe a debt of gratitude to members of that group who have helped me refine my understanding of this topic. This presentation will cover numerous composite parts of Marx's theory of money. It will start with the origins of the money form as the universal equivalent for exchange, then move on to how money abstracts itself from the material commodity that it originates from, how that then contributes to the price form and transactions replicate themselves. From there, we will see how money is metamorphosized into capital through the labor process and the implications this has for capitals as they swell with extracted surplus labor and become money capital, which performs a particular important function in the circulation of capital. So we begin with origin. So the origins of money come from the process of exchange. Marx begins Capital with an exposition of value. This is very important to understand how the money form comes to be. An item created by human labor has use values. When used for exchange, it becomes a commodity. The use value is often self-explanatory, food you need to eat, or it could be the materials to create other items. But also, other commodities have a social nature, such as precious stones or art. As human societies expand and produce more and more commodities, there comes exchange. In its original form, exchange would be done on a use value equivalence, which is insufficient as no two uses are ever really equivalent. For instance, to a thirsty man, water has a greater use value than to a person who is not. And so it is with all commodity. The use value is ultimately subjective, which does not make for a consistent exchange process. There's a good quote here. In order that these objects, commodities, may enter into relation with each other, their guardians must place themselves into relation with each other, which the quote here emphasizes the social nature of exchange, which is vital for understanding the true nature of the money form. Exchange is carried out by a commodity holder with a non-use value relationship with their commodity. That commodity therein achieves a new value, the exchange value, which to realize the commodity holder must exchange the commodity, regardless of the exchangee having any use for that commodity, or it ceases to have value at all. This is where the universal equivalent comes in. In the lack of a commodity that satisfies the use value needs of an individual, a socially acknowledged equivalent is used, a commodity set aside for such a purpose. Money is a crystal form of necessity in the course of the exchanges, whereby the different products of labor are practically equated to one another. This quote highlights the level and quality of money and that it renders all commodities to be equivalent. This, in practice, is of course a false equivalence. As already mentioned, the use value commodity is subjective, thus the social relation of exchange takes on an independent form, an alienating form that separates use value from exchange value. This foundational alienation underpins the majority of the arguments in Capital about the exploitative nature of the mode of production. Marx here points to the fact that money has taken many forms across human society. He proposes that its first incarnation is likely to have been cattle in nomadic groups, and in its more depraved forms it has been slaves, and in more developed forms of the capital it has even been land of capitalism. So that takes us on to the next section, which is about the abstraction of the money form. The introduction of the money forms begin to infiltrate a culture, and production ceases being strictly about use value and begins to be about the production of items for exchange, which in turn abstracts human labor from creating useful commodities and creating exchangeable commodities. Before long, all commodity comes to express itself in the money form, and without much mental gymnastics, we can see how this creates contradictions. It renders social production purely atomic and individualized rather than collectivized. And you'll notice I've got the same quote here as John picked for his presentation. I don't think it's a particularly good one. That is that relations in production assume a material character independent of their control. That is the separation of the commodity from the worker. Okay, so With this relation becoming established as a natural progression of the alienating force of money, the abstraction of the money form deepens. Money ceases to represent use value and begins to embody the labor time within a commodity. The longer the process to create a commodity, the greater its value, and through this calculation, a price is set. This, by and large, ignores societal value, but Marx acknowledges this as a particular and expands on it in other sections of the chapter that we will cover shortly. Chapter 3 also goes into the detail about the reasons why gold in Marx's time had become the global universal equivalent, which, while interesting, has lost some modern relevance on account of the fact we've deviated quite clearly from the gold standard, which we'll come to when we look at the kind of final section of this presentation. Marx in this section states that money is a purely ideal or mental form. This again speaks to the fact that it is but a human construct, a construct which is designed to mask the social relations of production. It goes further to explain how money came to be symbolic. Even though being named after a particular weight of precious metal, be that gold, silver, or copper, these standards had already begun to be deviated from in Marx's time. Currently, £1 of gold is the equivalent of £97.69, which again speaks to the social nature of the money form and its independent characteristics. Of course, because labour time is relatively intangible, price can never really reflect the magnitude of a commodity's value. So imagine a wood carver who's made many mistakes and had to restart his production process several times. The price of his final commodity cannot reflect the labour time because it exceeds the labour time of other wood carvings. Marx calls this socially necessary labour time, which John has already alluded to. Therein, there is an incongruity between the set price and the magnitude of value. While this may appear to be a flaw in the commodity production process, it adapts it well for the mode of production in that price ceases to express value. And all things tangible and intangible can therefore be given a price, including labour, importantly. Okay. So there's a good quote here again, which is the imaginary price form may conceal a real value relation. For instance, the price of uncultivated land. And again, this relates to what John was just saying as I arrived, which is that notion of the promise or the payment in the future of. The quote here is, so the quote in chapter 3 is from chapter 3, and we can see Marx tying down this abstraction into the world of capital production. That land that should, by the laws of value, be valueless, but by the laws of money, gain a price, not based on labour time expended in its creation, but in its potential to create commodity. This is an imaginary valuation of a commodity in the money form. With this in mind, we can begin to see how the circulation of commodities expands through the money form. And Marx uses a simple algebraic formula to represent the circulation of commodities. So in the first instance, we have C to M. A commodity is taken to the market with the intention of sale. Again, we are talking in terms of universals. This commodity could be anything, and it is given a price based on the socially necessary time of its production. The sale is realized and the commodity is dissolved into the money form so that it may be used in the purchase of something that meets the seller's use needs. Labour time embodied with the commodity in the commodity is also realized. Then we go on to N to C. Money is used to purchase a commodity that meets the needs of the buyer, and the commodity is bought at the market. Then it becomes CMC. Another commodity is exchanged for the money form and then exchanged into another commodity. This is the basis for mercantilism, and the exchange process melds these two independent processes into one. And this is the reproduction of the commodity chain. And it continues forevermore. Okay, so commodities move between buyers and sellers, and the range of commodities on offer ever expands to meet the needs of exchange. This is how commodities circulate and transform between commodities and money and back again. There's a large section here on the velocity of circulation, which speaks to the spread of commodity production and how that in turn explains the total sum of circulating money, which is currency. But I'm not going to go into more on that. We could spend the whole session on currency alone, but we're not going to. So we now go into a small bit on hoarding and the money payment, which again, John's already referenced, but I'll go into more detail on. The CMC chain that I just highlighted really leads to hoarding. Okay. As the exchange process continues, it becomes apparent that the money form is the most useful form in this chain, as it is versatile and can be used to meet needs at any given time, and therein is the most useful of commodities. It is now more important to convert the commodity into the money form. There's a quote here, which is, "The hoarder makes a sacrifice of the lust of flesh for their gold fetish." I like this. It's quite visceral. I love a visceral Marx quote. He's good like that. The quote here shows how to hoard the money form. There must be a withdrawal of money from the circulation of commodities, which in the first must be done at the expense of the exchange. The hoarder must continually produce commodity without expenditure to stockpile the money form, which becomes vital for adding and withdrawing currency from the CMC process, which grants control over production. With the hoard comes the capacity for credit. Credit itself is necessary in production due to the delay in production of commodity. Say it takes a longer time to bring a commodity to market, be that because of distance or difficulty in acquiring said commodity. It can be necessary to borrow or lend money to more quickly realize the price of commodity, to bring it to market, or invest in its creation. More on this later as we go into the money capital. Credit and certificates of debt circulate and become the norm of financial actions. First, between the holders of money, and beyond this, money becomes the universal subject matter of all contracts, that of labour, land, and law. Hoards become vast reserves of means of payment and intermittently enter circulation as credit. In this chapter, there is also reference to financial crisis, which John already mentioned. But again, I think it's better that we save this for another session where we talk about crises and Marx. I think we could expand on this a lot. But what we can see from this section is that the reserves of money required for the capitalist mode of production originate in the money form and in the exchange of commodity. Historically, in the West, we can place this process to the late medieval and Renaissance period, as this is a time when the exchange of commodity takes off wholesale. But now we're going to examine how money becomes capital, which really allows the capitalist mode of production to come into its own. So the transformation of money into capital is going to be quite a brief overview of this process. There's, again, Marx goes into great detail and splits this chain up into many different facets. So again, forgive the brevity, but I want to keep it digestible. So in the first instance, we have M to C. Okay, money is owned by a capitalist, enters into an enterprise. For this section, we shall say that this is in the production of fashionable trainers. Okay, why not? And that is a straightforward industrial relation. Startup cash is needed to buy the means of production, factory, materials, machinery, pay for the labor time, wages, etc., etc. And then it creates commodity. It creates commodity through the labor process. C to M, which is, as we've seen before, it's similar to the one that in the CMC chain. The fashionable trainers are taken to market and dissolved into the money form, as we saw with CMC previously. Now, when we roll these things together, it becomes a new formula. It becomes MCM prime. Okay, little apostrophe I call prime. I think it's commonly called prime. This represents the additional price of trainers sold as a result of the production process. This is profit. And the source of that profit is labor, specifically labor above the necessary labor time required to produce the product, what we would call surplus value, and is the chief reason for the exploitation of labor. M prime is no longer just money, but now money imbued with surplus value, and therein capital. Okay. Again, we could go into a lengthy expose here on wages and then the disparity in the created value of workers, which is really central to the critique of the capitalist mode of production in Capital. But the topic is money, not surplus value. And again, this process replicates as money re-enters the productive process, it increases in magnitude, and the profit margin increases, profits increasing forever, potentially forever, which we'll talk about later. So this brings me on to my final full section, which is on money capital. So we're going to take a bit of a jump forward here in the kind of study of capital. The first 2-3 sections were focused on the first 4 chapters. of volume 1. We now move forward to volume 3 and chapters 21 to 24, where Marx talks about money capital. This section focuses on the competing forces within capitals. There is more than one role that capital can take to assist it in circulation. Marx would describe money capital, which is capital that is hoarded up, and it's a big reserve of money that then can be put into the production process in other means. It no longer has to directly involve itself in the production process. He would describe this as fictitious capital, and that is not to say it's not real, but that it is built on social construction and it doesn't produce use value, and therefore is unproductive. David Harvey argues here that this creates an illusion of eternal growth, and the belief that interest and financialization provide the keys to eternal capitalism, and really blames the success of money capital for the ending of the gold standard in the 1970s and 80s in the West, and that currencies came away from the gold standard because it was hampering the potential for growth, and that they had to always call back to the gold. Now that money is just a number, it can potentially expand forever. So in Marx in chapter 23 states that a capitalist can be both money and a money capitalist and a productive capitalist, and they are both one and the same, and they could be a productive capitalist and they could be a money capitalist, and they look at business with both eyes. The money form reveals a further use value in this setting as well, and that use value is that money itself can be used to produce surplus value. Of course, it can't, but it appears to be that way by starting an MCM prime cycle. So extracting surplus labor, not directly of its own productive forces, but by using the productive forces of other capitalists. So it can do this by being loaned to another capitalist with interest, and this is where the interest-bearing part of this comes into play. So here we have another chain that we could look at. Okay, so if we start with an L, a loan of capital to productive capitalists from a money capital, and then we put it into the productive process that we've already established, MCM prime. And then we have an additional outcome, which is interest prime. Okay, so you can see that that this is reliant on a number of things. If it's reliant on a legal relationship between the money and the productive capitalist, that sets the rate of interest. Okay, it's a variable rate of interest. The rate of interest is another thing that we could spend the whole meeting talking about if we so wish. There are a number of factors that go into forming the rate of interest, such as risk and profitability of the commodity being produced. It's a variety of different things that we could talk about. This is how money capital then could enter the productive process. So I've got a picture here of a cordyceps ant. I thought this a cordyceps infected ant, I should say. I thought this was an appropriate image, particularly for this section. You can see money capital as a parasite then, in that it requires productive capital in order to continue its existence. In order to sustain itself, it must continually invest in the productive sphere. Is it a parasite then, or is it in fact the nervous system? Well, let's dig into that a little bit deeper. The cordyceps ant is an ant infected by a fungus. The fungus drives the ant to the top of the tree, and the fungus erupts from the head of the ant when it's up at the top of the tree and spreads its spores. I thought this was a particularly apt kind of allegory for money capital. The initial appearance is that money capital is a parasitic force and attaches itself to a host productive capitalist to extract interest. Money capital is going to be usually a kind of bigger and a larger capital, a more established capital, and it will seek smaller capitals, more petty bourgeois capitals to exploit. It will offer them a favorable loan in exchange for the interest rate returns. So in that sense, the money capital is then free to direct investment into areas that generate the most profit and have the highest rate of exploitation therein. Okay. And so in that sense, it acts as a common capital of the class. This notion represents kind of a bourgeois class consciousness, that any bourgeois, any businessman could access these funds to further their own capitalistic expansion. And on the other hand, it creates a tension within the capitalist class, in that interest sets the petty bourgeoisie at odds with the loaning money capital, as one is being exploited for the profit of the other. While this exploitation really pales in comparison to that suffered by the worker, it creates a factionalism between the bourgeois within the bourgeois class. In addition, interest can only be extracted from the surplus value part of commodity production. If it doesn't, then the productive capitalist in this instance, has failed to materialize any profit. So it has to come from the surplus value extraction, and therein this increases the pressures on the worker, as the industrial capitalist must achieve a higher rate of profit in order to pay the interest and retain the portion to which he's owed. Harvey, in his lecture on Class 6, really criticizes labor movements of the past for focusing too much on the immediate industrial productive capitalists, rather than looking at the kind of the forces behind it, the unseen part of the production process, which is the money capitalist. He argues that the barrier created by the relationship with the productive capitalist kind of diffuses class struggle, as workers are left to fight only the symptom, not address the disease. So you can see why so we'll come back to the allegory of the ant and the fungus. It's quite a similar kind of thing. You know, it starts off as a parasitic form and then begins to take ownership and can direct capital, especially when you know, some of the kind of capitals that we're talking about here, like the BlackRock investment firm, okay, and BlackRock Finance, they have a massive wealth that they can direct into areas that they consider to be economically viable, and therein they can direct productive forces. So it's parasitic, but also it is almost a nervous system for the flow of capital. Okay, so the impact of this relationship is still being felt to this day, and this is one of the reasons why I think capital is extremely relevant. So we come on to the conclusions. I've attempted to show here the relevance of Marx for understanding something we all take for granted: money. Money in its purest form represents the alienation of value, and that in turn creates the mystification process that enables the exploitation of labor. Based on what I've read, Marx didn't agree with the very conception of money, and he attempts to show us the corrosive effects it has on the social relations in the productive process. Above all else, Marx reveals that this is a social relation of production. It is not concrete and or true to the law of nature. It is something unnatural and a perversion of our human spirit. It leads to the production of commodity for exchange as opposed to the production for need that communism advocates. Not only that, but it reveals the complexity of the economic model that we must overcome to create a better world for the working class. It is for this reason that I stand by the learning and teaching of Marx's theory. For any economic model that to replace this ungainly beast must be equally complex and well developed. We must think of how to manage exchange so it stays within workers' moderation and doesn't fly into fetishism and hoarding. How do we create a system that liberates workers and allows all to meet their needs? How do we take the lessons from Marx and use them to direct struggle where it needs to be directed? And that's my conclusion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rob. If you could switch off your screen sharing, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you also to John. Not an easy subject, quite a complex subject. So well done, both of you, to trying to, you know, cohere a lot of work into a small opening. And I think you both succeeded. Thank you very much. Comrades, especially with a subject like this, please don't feel, you know, shy, or that you know, if you have any questions, anything you didn't understand or would like to comment on something further, please click raise hand and we can bring you in and discuss things. We wanted to look at a couple of questions before we're opening to the floor, and that is, the idea, I think that Rob just touched on at the end there, the difference between fighting the symptom and fighting the disease. It's the idea that could we again live in a society without money? There's nothing natural about money. As you said, it's as comrades have explained, it's a part of how capitalism works, etc. So if we know there have been societies that worked without money and worked for hundreds of thousands of years, could we go back to or go forward to a situation like that, or has society moved on so far that seems an impossibility? And what would have to change to allow for such a thing? Who wants to go first?
I'll go. So in terms of that, I think there's I think there's a lot that has to change in our society in order to get to a place where we could even consider existing without money. And I think the first thing that we'd have to kind of really look at is, what we produce and why we produce it, and how we produce it. I think it's all three of those questions really come to kind of problem that money presents, in that we've built our whole society, and all of us have lived our entire lives reliant on money, and and as John rightly pointed out in his presentation, it is reified. It's held above us as something that is unassailable. But then if we go back to the kind of bones of use, value, and need, we can find the answers. If we look at the way we can produce things in a collectivist way, I mean, we have to kind of change the way we look at commodity. I think you have to accept that if you are going to have production on this scale, the way the shape of things is going to be a little different, and we have to start thinking about what we actually need in our lives rather than just what we want. And I think that's a kind of a question that we're left with as a result of that.
Mm. And John, to you now, where do you pinpoint how money came about? When did it start coming about? And for what particular, is it linked to class society? Is it concretely capitalism mainly? Did it, make a jump there? When do we find the invention of money?
Sorry, I think that's a very difficult question that's still being asked, because it has got a long history, as has the commodity. Basically, it arises with commodity production, and that can be in a very restricted form in certain parts of society. I think Marx says usually on the outskirts of society, in, say, take an example, tribal society, trading with other tribes. So within the tribal unit, production will be for use, but there are certain needs or certain projected needs that can come about by mixing with other tribes. Trade can develop, and exchange can develop. I don't think there's any notion that has to be a form of barter, although it could be, but the trade between can take the form of a commodity trade, and money can develop within those forms of society. I think it's a very interesting point, because it's also linked by some writers, and I'm talking about somebody called Son Rethel, about intellectual and manual labor, about the formation of abstract thought. Now, philosophical thought, theorizing about things, and how that arises with societies based on money. There's an abstraction within the money form itself, and that writer associates it with ancient Greece, where there the philosophies emerge about the same time, I think in the 6th century BC, and start the money. Commodity form begins to develop, the money form begins to develop, and with that, abstract thought develops. So it is an interesting feature in itself. But I say it's got a long history, and there are societies without money, although money can take different forms, and some of the forms of trade rather than money, but money can develop, and people talk about shells, cows, women, everything basically being in some societies taking or being used as a money form, but the trade there. But I don't think sort of identified when exactly money emerges, although it could be within ancient Greece and you know, and previous to that. I just want to come back on this, you know, that the other point that Rob was talking about, and some people are talking about, was one of the things I want to talk about, and I think I mentioned it in that opening statement from Marx on, because he's concerned with money, the alienating effects, the negative effects of money on human relationships in general, as he experiences it and people experience it generally, and as we experience it. So I think one of the things that Marx develops is that notion of praxis, the idea of, you know, can you have a society without money? What sort of society would be a non-alienated society look like? To me, it would necessarily involve the abolition of money, a society without money. It's easy to say, but not easy to create. But there is then that notion of praxis that involves trying to think. The point is not nation think about what is possible and then work towards creating that form of society, and in which we live. The agency for that potentiality is the working class, identifying that need to create a different form of society through class struggle. That's the importance to me of the notion of money as a social relation. Social relations are things that can be changed. They change over time, and they can be changed politically and consciously. And it's that notion of praxis and change that's important, I think, about a social relation, because social relations can't be changed through legislative means, can't be changed from on top. That might be a part of how they change, but it fundamentally has to involve change from the bottom, through class struggle, through the class consciously trying to change society. The form of society that emerges will take different forms. We can't predict exactly how it could be, but in my mind, a society that's producing for human need, as Rob has said, rather than for profit, is a fundamental feature of a society that I would hope that we can try and create, and that would be a socialist society based on human need.
Thank you, comrade. We've got a couple of comrades with their hands up now, and it would be great to have a bit of a discussion going on that, because it is a rather complex issue. I think it would be good if you two can come in as and when people ask questions or make contributions. Hi, Peter. Peter will be joining us next week, by the way, and will be presenting next week's session. Hi there. Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yes, all good. Yeah, just a brief question, really. I know that, you know, it was a clear kind of exposition of money, alienation, exploitation, and how it's used in capitalism, and obviously how it dominates people's lives, money today. I just wondered whether, you know, when I was listening, then it became apparent that we're looking at Marx's work. So we're looking at his work on capital in, you know, relation to Rob in particular. And I'm wondering whether that all that he says about money as a real abstraction and its domination as money capital, we can take to understand in the real world as it develops. So, and I don't think Marx, you know, I think Marx would say, no, you can't. You have to kind of see this as a kind of, not, you know, not so much a model, but a drive to the essence of money, of capitalism. But you also have to recognize, along with his other writings outside of capital, that he emphasized class struggle. And he spoke about, in terms of class struggle and the developments of different societies, including capitalism, about the development of money through the, you know, through the changing formation of classes within history, including capital. And so it leads me to, you know, to think like, well, and this is just a question, and I suppose hopefully other people will be thinking this as well, that, well, if we, you know, it would be nice to be able to read capital and maybe understand totally different eras of capitalism, and whether we can just read off like a Bible what Marx is saying in capital and then superimpose it. So there are two different eras, like
social democracy, the era of social democracy, that particular era of growth of social democracy from the late 1890s to its termination in 1970, with all the twists and turns in society, does the real abstraction of money stay the same? And does the real abstraction of money, capital, stay the same post the 1970s when we move into a slightly different era with the collapse of social democracy and the beginnings of a kind of new relationship established between capital and labour? Some call neoliberal, some call globalisation, and interpose the two. But there's a different dimension to that relationship. Now, does that mean throughout all those things, money holds the same? It's a real abstraction. Rob, you mentioned earlier about the parasitic side of money and all the derivatives. And John mentioned just in passing before, quite rightly, about, that money, existed before, could exist post-capitalism, but in a different form. Can we do without money? I think Rob posed that question as well, but not for a long time, he was saying. But even today, money has been abolished in a way. It's become digitalized more. It's less directly related between people when they consume. You just have to kind of go to the bank and digitally create a bank account and then draw out some debt and then collect your consumptions. So there's a difference. Is that an ideal abstraction or a real abstraction going on? And you mentioned, Rob, about well, John said it was a real abstraction, and you mentioned it was an ideal abstraction. So I'm wondering whether it is ideal, or it's an ideal real abstraction, or in many senses we could say, just to end, that with money today and all the parasitic forms of money, in terms of stocks and shares, credit system, futures markets, and exchange, the use of money for purely exchange purposes has become ideal and less a real abstraction. And in that sense, well, where does that relate to class struggle? And where does it relate to the nature of capitalism today? And, we can't wholly understand that by just keeping on reading Marx's Capital, although we need to read Marx's Capital in order to be able to understand how capitalism developed. But we can't superimpose capital upon a reading of the present capitalist system.
Thank you, Peter. Rob and or John, got any reply on that? Yeah, go on, Rob.
I think that's a really good question from Peter there. I think it kind of strikes to what the usual kind of critique of approaching capital would be, and that is the kind of like notion of, well, the economy has changed and the way we relate to money has changed, and the way that and all this is now different. But I would say no. I would say that yes, like in essence, there are parts of capital which are no longer relevant, and I did mention that when I talked about kind of how Marx highlights gold as the kind of the best universal equivalent, the best money form, or why it's most suited to the money form. But there are those seeds that kind of allow us to see as a framework for understanding the foundation of capital and the basic laws that capital follows. A lot of the critique holds true. The fact that in Marx's time, he's already talking about the fact that that money becomes a symbol and it deviates from the material form, and in doing that, it does create a propensity for crisis. And if you look at what's happened to the economy since we've deviated from the gold standard in the Nixon did it in 1971, and then look at the kind of at the rate of growth over the last 30 years, you'll see that there is the stagnation as capital is attempting to kind of burst beyond banks that it can't physically burst through. It's hitting a wall in that sense. It's a crisis, but it's not like the end of capitalism. That doesn't mean it's the end of capitalism. It means that capitalism will have to adapt to suit a new model. But I do think that is it an ideal abstraction or a real abstraction? I think in a sense, the fact that you can, like you said in your example, Peter, there, that you can just go to a bank account, a hole in the wall, and look at numbers and pull out a debt at any point. That is the ultimate that is the aim of capitalism. Even in, if you look at other sections of Capital Volume 2, he always, Marx always makes reference to the fact that it's about the increasing the rate of turnover time. Now we have an economy where turnover time is instant. It's the logical conclusion of what Marx was saying. Now, he didn't predict it. He wasn't trying to predict it. He was trying to analyze his own system. But what we can see is how his analysis, you can apply it to our system. It doesn't yield exactly the same results. The material data is different, but the conceptual framework is the same. And that's the way I would look at it, really.
John.
Yeah, just on that notion, because I think there's some confusion over that notion of real abstraction. The way I'm using it, and the way I think Marx is using it, he refers into some of his so-called method, and he uses the method of abstraction himself, that abstracting from the whole to the part, but he's saying it in relation to money, that human beings involved in capital, in the capitalist mode of production under capitalism, make that abstraction every day in their lives. The way they use money is a real abstraction. They abstract from the total social wealth available to society by the use of money. So I think he's referring to in that way as the real abstraction that we indulge in, we take part in every day of our life. Just on the other points that Peter was raising about, basically, I think Robert has largely answered it, but money can take different forms, and that's essential. Marx goes through that, the different forms that money takes and the different functions that money fulfills. In order to be money, it has to perform a range of functions, measure of value, means of exchange, universal equivalent, all sorts of different forms and functions that it serves. It still remains money, and commodity production and capitalist production could not take place without a form of money. It would not be able to exchange profit. So there's got to be a form of money. Now that clearly changes over time, and Peter referred to digital money and money that's done over the internet and through moving amounts around. The other thing as to why it changes, I'm trying to get to grips with this, as the nature of the class struggle. Is it always the same? Basically, if value, abstract labor, is socially necessary labor time, that changes. Socially necessary labor time changes all the time. The productivity of labor, the different nation states, communities coming into production, being used in different ways. Also, trade union organization of the working class has an effect on the socially necessary labor time that's available to society. So it's a constantly changing feature. It's not something fixed over time, and money has to represent that in some way in order for the capitalist society to continue. So the important feature about that, I think, is that notion which talked about before, is that notion of the world market. And Marx talks about it from a very early stage in the German ideology, but even in the works of Capital. The next chapter is on money as capital. In chapter 4 of Capital, he goes that expansion necessary labor time and the way that relates to money, an abstract expression of that. Sorry, that's not very clear what I've said, but
you broke up a little bit as well at the end there, so made it just a touch more difficult. But can I get back to the question of digital money then, because that is quite interesting, Bitcoin, etc. Does that count as money? Can it become capital? Can it, does it have all the functions of money? Rob, I think.
So yeah, digital currency particularly is interesting. So I would class, based on what I've read of Capital and what I understand of the money form, I class digital currency as as equivalent to fiat money. It is money, but it is money issued, in a kind of away from the bank that doesn't have a material basis. It's a complete abstraction from money commodity in its original form, which means it is, that's transactional money. It's fiat money, which means it's the symbol of money, which means it's money. It's still money. It still goes in circulation. It still is part of the capital exchange process. But it's kind of dangerous in the fact because it is even more of a mystification on value. The currency, because it's so controlled by systems that are unseen to the working class, it increases that mystification. And gold used to be kind of out of the reach of your ordinary worker, but now gold is within the reach of the ordinary worker. But the amount of money attainable is almost impossible through fiat money. So it's important. Bitcoin, I think, is interesting because Bitcoin it serves as it's created with the intention of being the money form, but it is not in common circulation yet. It cannot be used as a universal equivalent. You cannot buy everything with Bitcoin. So therein, it's not itself money. It is fictitious capital at the moment. That's not to say that it couldn't become more. It couldn't move from the kind of realm of fictitious capital into the realm of currency, if it was to become a widely used universal equivalent, which it has the capacity to do. However, I do think that states won't support the use of Bitcoin because of its very untrackable nature, and that it's designed to be encrypted in a private currency. Obviously, for taxation purposes, the state wants to keep an eye on financial transactions. So I don't think the state will endorse Bitcoin. I think there's a couple of states that have accepted Bitcoin as a national currency, but I don't think in the kind of Western capitalism that's going to become a norm.
Because it's interesting, it is out of the hands of the state, isn't it, Bitcoin, which is different to real money, as abstract as money even is. I mean, but it could be envisaged that's wouldn't states do something about that, and especially like an era's imperialism, more than not endorse it? Well,
it's important to kind of point to that distinction between state and capital. That the two are not, the notion of kind of competing capitals. There's a section of capitalist society that very much wants Bitcoin, and there's a section of capitalist society that doesn't want Bitcoin, and those competing capitals are kind of outwith of our humble controls. So, in a sense, it is an interesting question, but in a sense, it's also it's fetishism, and we should be careful.
Don't invest in Bitcoin.
Well, it depends if you want to make money or not. I suppose that's the question. So.
Well, John, do you have anything else to say on that? You broke up a little bit towards the end.
No, I think there's enough people waiting to speak. I would say, but in my view, Rob's right. But Bitcoin is an asset, basically. It's a financial investment. It's a form of money. That's my view.
Thank you, Cheryl, please.
Oh yeah. My thoughts about getting into a world now where we actually don't use physical money is becoming more and more common, whether actually that gives more power and control over the ruling capitalist class. And what came to mind was a news item about Lebanon, and people having earned their money, it goes into the bank, and then the banks are all shut down. When it was I can't remember the actual detail of it, but all the banks shut down, so people had been paid but they couldn't go and get the money out, and so there were almost like riots of ordinary people outside of the banks because they couldn't get the money out of the bank. And it seems to me, if you then don't, I can see that it would give more control to the ruling class if people physically did no longer have money. It seems like an advantage to them, because they could do what they were doing in Lebanon, which is people are earning money and not able to get the money out, and were starving to death. And then on a separate, just a really separate quick point, I did David Harvey's classes, which were so difficult to follow, I have to say. They're so complicated. But one of the things he was talking about, I think, Rob, if you did the course, you might remind me of this thing about fictitious money, of all of these very complex sort of financial instruments now, and how that was all behind the whole issue of subprime mortgage. That was what created the financial crash in 2008. And the subprime mortgage, saga, of which at the end of the day it was working people who lost out. And actually, out of that crash, the banks and property owners made vast amounts of money on buying all of those repossessed properties. And it just seems like, since Marx wrote Capital, the complication of how the financial system works, it seems to give much more power and control over the capitalist class, because it's all so mystified in terms of how those things work and operate. Companies going in, buying up lots of debt. David was talking about companies, lots of debt in one South American company. One corporation bought up all the debt and then sort of held the government to ransom for not paying the debt. It was quite a almost Kafkaesque scenario. Anyway, you can always watch his classes online, but I just found it very fascinating. But yeah, I just wonder whether or not the disappearance of actual money, physical money, it is going to present a problem about less control over. Yeah, that's just my thoughts anyway.
Thank you, Cheryl. I guess it depends on how it's done and who's doing it, doesn't it? Rob, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the way that we currently have it, the capitalist really has the best of all worlds, in that, we work away, we have our surplus value, our surplus labor extracted, and we get a number back in return. We don't get a physical thing that we can hold, or something that we could use internationally. We don't get any weight of gold. There's no concrete value that we can extract from our money form that we can use elsewhere. And as you rightly point out, if you are a criminal, if you are beyond the law, you can the state has mechanisms by which you can immediately turn off your supply of money immediately. Okay, so it does have a facet of control, and in that sense we can see that the new form of money is another kind of lever of control on the working class, another thing to keep us down, another thing to keep us subordinated to it, which as we've seen through the production process, is its ultimate intention. It needs us to produce a surplus value, but it wants us in a demonized and controlled state by which we have no choice but to produce that surplus value. There's a few other things you mentioned there. You're right about David Harvey. He is. I've found him easier to get to grips with after prolonged exposure, I guess. I kind of went back a few times and again, and kind of. I was like, okay, now I'm following, and he does kind of give an insight into Marx that I think is quite user friendly, which is difficult at times, because like Capital is sometimes just the words. There's some real doldrums in volume 2, and it's just like, what is happening here? With Harvey's Expo, you do get a lot out of it. But I think you made an interesting comment there about like kind of the nature of fictitious capital and the financial sector. Now that term fictitious capital is in itself a little misleading from Marx, because it's not fiction, it's real, and just as the abstraction is real, just as as the alienating force of money is real, even though it is a concept, it has a material impact, and that material impact drives the productive forces that we face. So it's not, you shouldn't just dismiss or poo-poo the idea of the financial sector, because it's serious and it's real. And I think this comes back to what Peter was saying actually as well about class struggle and the relevance of capital to class struggle, in that it can help us. As Sun Tzu says, know thy enemy, know the enemy. And through study of the mechanisms of capital and the way in which it works and the way it operates, you can, I believe that there could be a way that you can, see the best way to kind of have class struggle that's effective. And I do think that targeting the financial sector is one of those ways. Withdrawing from banks is one potential, or setting up businesses that are in antithesis to it is something that other people propose. I wouldn't propose that, but I do think there are other. You get another kind of sphere of class struggle if you kind of approach capital from that way.
John, would you like to say something?
Not a great deal, because I've watched Harvey, and within our group we did feature around Harvey. I mean, but I think the important thing to realize, as Rob said, he's very user friendly. You can gain a lot from watching Harvey, but he's by no means a revolutionary socialist. He is a reformist, what he would class as socialist, but he tends to, what he wants is not the abolition of money. I don't think, or the abolition of wage labor. Harvey would not even consider those things. What he wants is a regulated capitalism. He relates to the periods in the past when trade unions were strong, when local councils were strong, etc. So underneath it all, and that becomes very important when you're dealing with his analysis of capital and what Marx means when he's using certain terms within capitalism. So you've always got to take that into account. I think, on the feature that Cheryl was mentioning, that it has become increasingly mystifying. It was mystifying enough when Marx was dealing with it. It's become far more mystificatory now because of the nature that that money has taken, the different forms that money has taken. But it's important to bear in mind that they are different forms of money, not the abolition of money in itself, because we use credit cards and online bank accounts, etc. That does not get rid of money. It just, in my opinion, makes a different form of money. I think the other important thing is, you were talking about the crises of that. I think you're right. If money was suddenly to collapse, which it does do, which it did nearly in 2008 in this country and the United States, then it is the working class who suffer from that. The access to the money, the capitalist class can withdraw and can use their assets. They don't suffer from that. So without an organized, so the idea behind a socialist revolution has got to be that involvement, that aim to get rid of the capitalist mode of production, but it's got to be done in an organized fashion, in a collective fashion. And in fact, that's the notion of class struggle, isn't it? It's what Marx talks about in the thesis on Feuerbach. It's change through self-change. The working class has got to change itself in order to change society. I know that sounds utopian in itself, given the present state of consciousness, but it still remains, the essential feature. And given the nature of the society in which we live, it becomes more and more urgent to get that message across, that there has to be an alternative to the capitalist society in which we live. Otherwise, we're going to end up with no society at all.
I mean, for socialists, I think the abolition of money is actually not top of the agenda, is it? It is exactly as comrades have outlined. It's the mode of production, how things are produced, who's producing it, who's deciding what is produced by whom and how. I think these are the key issues. And money will almost plays no role, but facilitate us perhaps for a while. And then once we've started restructuring society, if we get the chance to do it, it becomes, not necessary anymore, perhaps. Ian, please, come in.
Good evening, comrades. A couple of little things. Do we not need to draw a distinction between coinage, as it were, and money in the capitalist sense? I mean, you can go back to ancient Mesopotamia or ancient China and find examples of something we call money that was used to exchange things. And yes, it may well have been a kind of universal equivalent, whether it was copper or bronze or silver or gold. But that's different to how capital accumulates. Rob at one point used the term hoard. And I think there's a distinction, isn't there, not to be drawn between a hoard and an accumulation of capital. Capital is, as it were, money in the act of accumulation. And that's the distinction, really. And under capitalism, money, capital, to be capital, it has to be in the act of accumulation. It's a dynamic force, whereas coins used by Roman soldiers to pay for eggs from a local peasant isn't. It's merely a tool, as it were, to facilitate that exchange, but it's not in the act of accumulation. Yes, of course, you can save up your sestertii and maybe buy your freedom or whatever. But generally speaking, production in the ancient world and in feudalism wasn't in those terms. For a feudal landowner, wealth was the land, and the surplus extracted from a peasantry might have taken all sorts of forms, whether it was in terms of forced labor, whether it was in terms of a proportion of the produce that was handed over. The church extracted part of the surplus in terms of tithes, which would often be a part of the surplus, and so on. And yes, of course, these did enter circulation, but largely at the margins. What is so distinctive about capitalism is that the accumulation of capital becomes a central feature, the central feature. And moreover, if capital isn't accumulating, it's not capital. It ceases to be capital if it doesn't accumulate. So just this distinction between a hoard and the accumulation of capital, there has to be that dynamic of accumulation. And then, of course, if we go back to capital, good old Karl Heinrich, to work all that stuff out was just brilliant. But of course, we need to go much further. And to look at fiat money, for example, I mean, there are areas in capital where Marx alludes to paper money, for example, which is not the same as gold. But, at the time, you could exchange your pound sterling for a pound of silver. But of course, he was perfectly aware that the paper money or coinage took a different form, and he could already see that was the basis for instability and so on. I mean, as I see it, the development of fiat money is a step towards eventually no money. I can easily foresee a no money. I mean, if you go back to the critique of the Gotha program, Marx suggests instead of having money, having labor certificates, and you take them to the common storehouse and you exchange your labor certificate for potatoes or whatever you want. And of course, that's because then he was having a discussion with the anarchists about labor certificates and that kind of thing. And you can see his point that here was something that was used for exchanging for use values that were not being used to accumulate. These were exchanged for use values. But of course now, I don't use cash from one day to the next. And of course, that doesn't mean to say money's gone, but it does open up the possibility of the abolition of money. And it's another one of those neat little ways in which capitalism seems to create the basis for its own abolition. And as regards Bitcoin and various other kinds of, is it not just a huge Ponzi scheme? I mean, it seems so unstable. It seems to be highly likely to simply collapse in a kind of new South Sea bubble, as it were. I would avoid it like the plague. But anyway, that's just me being overcautious, perhaps. But thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Ian. Rob, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think, I want to come back straight away on that kind of hoard and the distinction between hoard and capital. I did attempt to make that distinction, though I might have blurred the lines in my presentation. The hoard is the pre-capitalist accumulation of the money form, which you can see if you go to, if you go and look at Venice, for instance, you go to Venice and look at the merchants' houses, you will see the hoarding of money that was going on within the mercantile class in a pre-capitalist society. That is not to say that hoards necessarily, become capital, but that the hoard is the origin of capital. In that, the hoard isn't necessarily going to become capital, but then the hoard applied in the productive process becomes capital. So that was, when I talked about hoards, it was in the origin of money, and then the relation of the origin of money to the origin of capital. So it's that kind of transitionary stage between the money form existing as the equivalent exchange. It's also easy with Marx to kind of think, he's looking at things conceptually, he's abstracting. So he doesn't put a date or a timeline on when things happen, chronologically in history. He just, says that there is this movement that you can detect in the origin of money that then goes into these habits that form because of the money form, and those habits that form because of the money form then take the shape of the capitalist mode of production in their final kind of in their final rendition, and the most idealized way of fulfilling the kind of commodity fetishism towards money, that obsession with money and greed, that he spends a long time kind of railing against in all of his works. So I think things like labour certificates, if he wrote about that in the critique of the Gotha programme, I would kind of I've not read that myself. It's probably a gap in my knowledge. I'm relatively fresh into the study, but I'll have to go and have a look at it. But I don't think labour certificates, but that would be a symbol, and a symbol that Marx acknowledges. It's that distinction between the money form and labour. You're right that you're right to point to a Roman soldier paying kind of a few denarii for a couple of eggs, but then he's a Roman soldier. Look what the money form is paying for. It's paying for crucifixion. It's paying for the genocide of the Gauls. It's paying for what in this instance. And the Greeks, the Greeks had a huge slave trade, massive slave trade, abhorrent human rights record on the Greeks. It's really bad. Like in terms of complete kind of annihilations of whole populations, like decimations. Kind of thing. Now, this is not to say that money in itself is evil, but it's that the way that money was used, especially in the feudal relation as well, is that it's an exercise of power. It's an exercise of manipulating populations to do what you will them to do. If you look at in the feudal society, what the money form was used for then. The money form in the feudal society was used, pretty much expressly for the purposes of feudal lords paying their taxes to the king. And that was, the original establishment. That's why they used it in the feudal society. It wasn't generally accessible. And then in the purchase of commodity from other merchants. So it's that kind of relationship of money and power and power and money. I think it echoes into the past. So I think Bitcoin as a Ponzi scheme. I think you're kind of right that it could be a Ponzi scheme, but I think it is trying to be something that isn't. But it's all about whether it gets the support from capital that it needs to be able to exist. I think you could lose a huge amount of money in Bitcoin, but it also could become the new universal equivalent. It's not, it has potential either way. It's a currency. It's attempting to be a new currency. So in that sense, it's trying to be the money form. But obviously, to be the money form, it needs to be a universal equivalent, and it really isn't that yet. So not worth much at the moment, but might become that. It depends how the economy moves, I guess.
You've invested, haven't you?
I haven't invested. I wouldn't invest.
Quite right.
But I'm just saying it's not black and white.
No. As I understand, labor vouchers were briefly considered by Marx. I don't think he writes it at a great length, but it's as a way to deal with the transitionary period, really, when you don't have states in control of money anymore, or capitalists in control of money, but transition towards a society where people just get what they need and produce what they need, and you don't have to have those kind of vouchers anymore. John, did you want to reply to Ian?
There's a lot there, isn't there? I mean, I'd come back to you. You said it, when you said to Rob, you think you've invested in Bitcoin. I think that's what it is at the moment. It is an investment rather than a money, and it might aim to become a universal equivalent. So do a lot of different currencies at the moment. They all aim to be, the dominant currency seems to be the dollar, and everything is reflected in the dollar, even by those who are opposed to that and want to create alternatives to it. It still remains the dominant currency. I think with all these things, that idea of labour vouchers or chits, I think you're right that Marx considered it. He also criticised Proudhon, for that sort of feature. And basically, he says that it's not money because it can't be exchanged. It's not exchanged in the same way that money is. You just draw on according to the levy that you carry out from the store of goods that are created. But you're right. I think it just flirts with that. The thing with everything that we talk about is it's got to be put in the context of the production at the time. What is the potential? And I think for Marx, even at the time when he's writing Capital, certainly for Engels, they talk about the creation of the world market, the nature of global production being to such an extent that it can meet all human needs. It's only the nature of the system that keeps those needs on a restricted basis, creates new needs that can't be fulfilled. But also, if you take a total transformation of the productive system, capital, as he said, the social relations of capital hold back the production, the productive forces and the development of productive forces. Not that you just want to produce everything potentially, but even to meet human need is not the aim of capital. The aim of capital is accumulation of capital, has been said. And just on that notion, as well about the hoard, because it is important, societies have in the past hoarded in terms of use values. But you can hoard so much wheat, you can hoard so much physical gold, but you have to have somewhere to keep it. You have to have it in a certain condition. With money, there are no limits to money. It can be accumulated indefinitely, and that's the thing. But also, it's important to distinguish, I think, between those notions of the hoard, withdrawing money as capital from circulation, keeping it. Misers do it, don't they, or are supposed to do it, but also certain capitalists do it. That notion of creating a form of wealth that you can use for the future, but also that notion of withholding a form of wealth for an upturn in the economy, potential capital. And that's a feature of society today. There's no lack of money, but there's a lack of a potential to invest that money to make profit, to accumulate capital. So a hoard can be a way of withdrawing from circulation, not just totally as a form of wealth, but as a potential capital. So when the upturn comes, which a lot of capitalists think will happen at some time, you will then have that capital to invest and make a stack of money out of it. But I think with all these things, you've got to take into account the nature of the productive system in which we're involved with. It's my view that you have a society, Jeff Barr talked about it previously, about shortage. There's a society in which you have a potential of abundance to meet human needs. Has to be regulated, has to be done on a democratic basis, but that is there. It's capital that makes that unworkable, and capital that will force it into a crisis before it will change into something that meets human needs.
Very good summing up. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Rob. We've got no more hands up, but I think we've covered things as much as we can. I mean, I should echo Rob as well. This was one session on Marx and money. There's loads. We didn't even touch on issues like abstract labor, concrete labor, profit. I mean, there's all huge issues that we could go into, and we probably will if the sessions continue. Oh, John, go on.
Yeah, just one final point, because that when I'm reading this, and one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss that was because the nature of the sessions is why Marx. for me, the most important feature of Marx is his political economy, his critique of political economy. And those, you know, those writings to me seem quite fundamental to any sort of notion of why Marx. And we do have to go back to considering those. And yet you have to say that a lot of, you know, Marxist and left-wing organizations do not relate to Marxist political economy. They relate to getting out on the streets or going on the demo, you know, the activity, which is important, but the fundamentals of the political economy are what makes Marx so important, and we can't lose sight of that.
Absolutely. And the discussion we just had on the need for, you know, the need for abundance to even consider socialism, and it gives an insight into what socialism was actually be, where you don't need paper vouchers or whatever, but where we have the facilities and the production, you know, the level of production to allow everybody to survive and live and be sheltered and lead a good life. It just needs to be under our control, and that's what capitalism has actually, as you know, we've been talking about. Capitalism has opened this up for us, which wasn't possible at Marx's time. Actually, now we're in a situation where socialism becomes realistic. It becomes a realistic option, and we need to be schooled and trained into how we can overthrow it. And that means we need to know where it came from and how it functions, so that we understand how to get rid of it. So, but comrades, if you are more interested, if you're interested in those details, you know, the difference between use value, exchange value, which are really, really interesting actually, but we couldn't get into it too much. Look at David Harvey. Reading Capital by yourself is a toughie. Very few people manage it, but the videos of David Harvey are good. Both John and Rob are involved in a study group. There's loads of study groups on capital, which give a lot of insight if you're into that. David Harvey is a good one, and his books are quite useful as well to accompany a study of Marx. No doubt we will get back to some of these issues, because we want to now work through chronologically, in a sense. We're now looking at various issues in today's society, how Marx still has something to teach about that. We're then going to go into the question of agency. How should we organize? You know, what ideas, what practical steps did Marx and Engels take in organizing not just themselves, but also the working class, the advanced sections of the working class? And then how would that transition work? How did it work when it happened? The very few short periods when the working class was in charge, and how would that change things like money, like profit, like the economy, etc., etc. So we've got still quite a few sessions to go, and we hope you will continue joining us on these sessions. So next week, we've got Peter Kennedy, who made a contribution briefly earlier on, and he will talk about the political economy of this transition period. So be hoping to see lots of you next week. Good night, comrades.